Hello, welcome everybody. All right, we're seeing folks start to join our webinar today. Hello. Once you join, please go ahead and open the chat box in your window here, and we'd love to hear your name and where you're based. I can go ahead and start. My name is Mostoufi. I'm the Senior Education Manager at the Pulitzer Center, and I'm based in DC today. I'm joined by two of my colleagues. Maybe Natalie, can you start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Natalie. Nathalie Applewhite. I'm the Managing Director at the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and thrilled to be here speaking with you all today.
Hello there, my name is Marina Walker Guevara. I am originally from Argentina, but I am based in Maryland and really thrilled to be with you. I am Executive Editor at the Pulitzer Center.
Fantastic. And we have behind the Pulitzer Center image, our colleague Hannah Burke, also from the education team. And I think all of us are in DC today, but we're excited to have folks with us from Kansas City, from Orlando, from New Jersey, from California. As you join, please, again, add into the chat where you're based, your name. We saw Anne from McLean just join. Excellent. We have Sanela joining us from Italy today, Sarah from New Jersey, nice. Julie from Milwaukee, welcome. And I'm seeing for some of you, the message is coming to me, Natalie, and Marina. But in order to share with the entire group, just check that the blue button above where you're typing, that you have the setting to all panelists and attendees. That way everyone will see your responses. So here's what we have in store today. We have an exciting discussion about what underreported stories are, why they're important. This is at the core of the Pulitzer Center's mission, and we have two of our experts here to tell us about that. And also, as educators, we're going to explore the question of how students can start to look for these stories themselves, especially as many are learning remotely. We'll make sure to leave plenty of time for your questions. And the way that we want to start gathering questions is using the Q&A box that you'll also see on your screen. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a moment. But before we start talking, having this conversation amongst ourselves, we want to know a little more about you. So on the screen now, you'll see a poll appear, and we'd love to hear, using this poll, who you are teaching or who's the community that you're primarily working with. So Hannah, go ahead and launch poll number 1, which is, what age group do you primarily work with? Early childhood, elementary, middle school, high school, and I know many of you might be working with many ages, so you can respond as many times as you like. Once you finish putting in your poll response, please go ahead and add into the chat what have been some of the challenges and opportunities that have been presented as many of us have begun teaching remotely. We definitely want to keep these in mind as we are going through the presentation today. So that's something I'm seeing that some of you are navigating student engagement, access to internet and technology. Thank you, Laureen. Martha is talking about lack of participation by our students. Let's go ahead and close this poll and see where most of us are from in 3, 2, and all right, we've got a primarily high school group today, but a mix of everyone, which is exciting because really we have some experts on our panel today, but we also consider everyone here an expert, especially in the students that you work with and the work that you do. So we'll be leaning on you as well. Hopefully our goals today speak to some of the challenges that you've written into the chat today. After we speak a little bit about Pulitzer Center's mission and our education programs, we're going to look at some methods that you can use to introduce underreported stories to students, but also to brainstorm as a community ways that these stories can support your teaching and also your students as they're learning remotely. And thank you, Brooke, for bringing up parent engagement, maybe also to support parents as they are becoming teachers who are teaching remotely. And this is where I want to talk about that Q&A function. So throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A box to add questions. We might respond to you directly, but we'll also be pulling from these during the Q&A section. Don't worry if you put your question in the chat box, we'll see it there too, and we'll make sure to get to it. But I know Nathalie and Marina have planned for a sort of interactive discussion with us, and we hope that you'll also use the chat box to interact there. A quick note before we launch into our specific discussion today. The Pulitzer Center is proud to partner with educators as part of our mission, and we understand that this is a unique time for educators and for journalists, another audience we work closely with. So at any point, if there are questions unrelated to this discussion, ways that you need support, you can reach out to us at education@pulitzercenter.org. Also, please include any questions, suggestions in the Q&A box or the chat. So I'm seeing some names here of educators we've worked with before, but for those of you who have not worked with the Pulitzer Center, our mission is up here on the screen. We are aiming to raise awareness of underreported global issues through direct support for quality journalism across all media platforms and a unique program of education and public outreach. Essentially what that means is that we are hoping that issues that are not getting enough attention, these underreported stories we'll learn more about today, that we can bring attention to them by making sure they happen, supporting journalists who tell these stories, helping those stories get published. But also, I think we've all seen that sometimes things happen in the world and our attention goes to those things. To make sure underreported stories still get attention, we also have programs of education and outreach. These are some of the outlets that we've worked with in the past several years. Go ahead and join in the chat box. Are any of these news outlets that you check regularly? Or do you see an outlet here that you don't ever check? You could add that into the chat box. We know that these stories, part of why they get underreported is that we're all reading different things. We're also reaching audiences in a lot of different places, and also by covering a lot of different stories. The journalists who receive grants from the Pulitzer Center are following issues they're passionate about. And what that means is we have reporting on everything from the environment and climate change, governance, the experiences of children and youth, issues related to conflict, to migration, you name it, our journalists are covering it, or if you name it and our journalists aren't covering it, they probably will want to know that because they'll want to cover it. So what I want to know a little bit before we launch into our discussion is how much do you think your students are engaging with your news, especially right now? We'll go ahead and launch this poll here, and you can actually respond a few times if you're thinking of different students. Would you say that right now your students are looking at the news several times a day, every day, a few times a week? When you were with them at school, or even when you're interacting with them now, as many of you teach remotely, what are they talking about? What do they look at in the news? If you could share that with the chat, I think that will be really helpful to our panelists today. So we'll go ahead and close our poll here in 3, 2, 1, and let's take a look at our results. And you can see the mix. So it looks like our students, depending on where we are, looking at a lot of different news stories and at different rates. I'm having trouble pulling up the chat on my screen. Maybe Marina, do you see in the chat right now, what are some of the themes that kids are looking at or students are looking at home?
Let's see. So there have been a couple of comments that were interesting. For example, some of the teachers asked where the outlets from Africa were and whether the Pulitzer Center also supports collaborations and stories outside the US. And I wanted to answer that we very much do that. And especially now during the pandemic, it has been an incredible opportunity to expand our model and to support consortiums of journalists in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, and around the world. So yes, while we saw in the slide, there were a lot of US media represented, that's only a slice of the media that we work with.
Mm. And I'm seeing that what news outlet looks pretty different for students too. We have some students looking at things they can get access to in school, like CNN. Students are looking at TikTok. Students are looking at some of them wanting to know about the coronavirus, a story many of us are following, and some are less interested. We have seen this kind of variation in how students are engaging with the news across our country. This is a screenshot of a study by the Pew Research Center from 2016. And you can see here that in looking at the demographics or breakdown of demographics and how often people of different age groups are engaging with news, we see that maybe this age group where our students are headed are not only following news less of the time, they might be feeling less trusting, and they might be looking at the news when they do in locations where like social media, websites, apps, where news is not the only thing that they're seeing, right? So in response to this kind of variation in how students are understanding what news is and where they're looking for it, the Pulitzer Center has a clear education mission where we hope to cultivate a more curious, informed, empathetic, and engaged public by connecting students and teachers with global news stories and the journalists who cover them. And so if that's something that you want to get involved with while you're teaching virtually, we're going to talk about some opportunities at the end here. And these are what some of those opportunities might look like. All of our reporting is available for free on our website. So if you don't have a subscription to an outlet we've worked with, you can still find that story on our site. We have lesson plans, journalist visits, and workshops like the one that you are going to experience today. But I've used this term a lot, underreported stories. And one of the biggest questions I get when talking to students is, what is that? And what's that word you keep using? So what I'm curious before we hear from our panelists to lead us in this discussion is, what do you think an underreported story is? And why are there some stories that they are underreported? So go ahead and open up your chat box and share. What is an underreported story and why is it underreported? And we'll take a look here. And it'll be interesting for us who have dedicated our time and our focus to these kinds of stories to see what do folks think that is. Sue's telling us underrepresented people. So these are stories of people who aren't represented. These are newsworthy stories, but not clickbaity, says Martha. Local, regional stories, Sue's adding here. People who some might believe don't matter, says Francis. Stories not getting primetime and media coverage may be a question about bias in coverage. So at this point, it sounds like a good time to turn it over to our panelists to start this discussion. Nathalie and Marina, welcome. How did we do in our assessment of what underreported stories are and why they're underreported?
I think the teachers have a really good idea of what these stories are and why they matter. These, underreported stories are really important stories that touch on the deeper societal issues that affect us all, but that are overlooked by the media. Due to many of the reasons that you are writing on the chat, because they speak about uncomfortable issues, about communities that are often not represented in the media. These are stories that have a lot of context, nuance. We don't see often sometimes nuance in breaking news. There are stories that take time to report and that can definitely not be reported from a desk. To do an underreported story, to do one of these in-depth stories, you have to get out to the real world and to talk to real people and to the people that represent the variety of experiences in a community.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say at the most, superficial level, of course, there's stories that deserve attention, but that don't get it. But they are the stories that explain what do get attention, right? It's the underlying root causes of these problems that end up becoming these massive global crises. So from climate change to gender rights, migration, global health, ethnic and religious racial tensions that are far away, but also in our own backyards. It's also these slow moving stories, right? That, as Marina said, of course, these take time to tell and resources to tell, which is why the Pulitzer Center exists. And they don't always seem like the most sort of, clickbaity, right? But how do we make them clickbaity, I guess, is the question, or not make them clickbaity, but find ways to make them engaging. And one of our former journalists, Jennifer Marlowe, had this wonderful quote about how oftentimes the news serves as a spotlight, and what she seeks to do in her reporting, and I like to apply it to the Pulitzer Center more generally, is to be a floodlight. So that we were focusing beyond just the immediate and the breaking news and looking at this one particular spot, and really trying to understand a much larger sort of ecosystem and what are the factors that are leading to the things that do make the news. If I can share my screen really briefly, I'll give you guys a little comical relief.
Nathalie, do you want to share your analogy with spinach or broccoli?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing here.
Okay.
So I feel like I should update it to kale, but everybody likes kale. So I've often described what we do at the Pulitzer Center as sort of the broccoli of news, right? It's the news you need, but not necessarily the news you want or that you know you want. And so our challenge at the Pulitzer Center is to support projects that are nutritious, you know, that are giving you the news that you need, but that are also really beautiful and exciting and that make you actually want to eat them. And so, yes, the challenge is making beautiful broccoli. So I will stop my screen share there. I hope.
And I would like to jump in and say, so Nathalie and Marina wear a lot of different hats at the Pulitzer Center, but one of those is helping to identify underreported stories for us to collaborate on. Could each of you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in these kinds of stories in your lives, and how did you decide to start dedicating yourselves to sharing these stories with the world? Maybe Marina, could you start, and then Nathalie?
Absolutely. So as I said before, I come from a relatively small place in Argentina, in Western Argentina, called Mendoza, a place that also has pretty big disparities between wealthy and poor. As a very young journalist, I was never too interested in running after the news or the breaking news. I was also not very fast. I wasn't writing fast enough. And I always wanted to kind of take a step back, and I was more of like a big picture kind of person. I learned that asking the question how and why often led me to better stories and to deeper look at the same story that everybody else was running after, but I was able to bring a different perspective. I remember a particular story that I will always carry with me. And it was about a very young kid, probably the age of the kids that you teach, about 13 or 14 years old. And he had been involved in a series of violent crimes. So you can imagine, in a relatively small town, it was the talk of the town, and the media was like constantly writing stories about this kid. And of course, the stories were all focusing on the latest crime and the violence and the way he looked and how young he was. And what I did, I was always looking for documents. I really like to document my stories. So I kind of traced his steps all the way since he was born. And I kind of like went to the institutions that were charged with supporting him, with giving him a chance in life, and was able to document two things: how some of those institutions had failed him and needed to be held accountable. So suddenly we are not just blaming the kid, we are looking at a more systemic issue, which is institutions that were supposed to protect him. And I also was able to find stories of hope. There was a time where his teachers were saying, this kid is promising, this kid writes well, or does something else well. His name is Matthias, by the way. So that story for me, that's an example of how we go about an underreported story. Not the breaking news, not the latest crime, but digging into the root causes of what we are seeing, of the crisis that we are seeing in the media at the time.
Thank you for sharing. And what about you, Nathalie? How did you come to focus on underreported stories in your work?
Yeah, I mean, my background, I'm also sort of an international background. I lived in part in France, and my mother's French. And so from an early age, I was sort of looking at how countries, people, populations look at each other, and coming from an anthropology lens. And then that led me to anthropology, and studying anthropology, you know, was very much about kind of what we would call, I think, in the journalism world, slow journalism, looking at things carefully, trying to understand how do we translate another culture? How do we translate issues to others? But it felt very much like it was in its own bubble, and that we were only reaching other anthropologists. And I started reporting and doing documentary work around conflict, and trying to understand the underlying causes of conflict versus just reporting on how many dead, what are the politicians saying, like who are the people who are really suffering in the conflicts that we hear about, but at such a superficial level. And that led me to grad school, and I thought I was putting, you know, media behind me, and it just brought me right back to media, studying peace and conflict studies, thinking like, what is the role of news and journalism in understanding and in translating the world around us? And there's just this balance between those two, right? We want to reach a wide audience, and so the news and journalism landscape is a wonderful way to reach a wide audience. But how do we do that in a way that actually also provides substance and depth, you know, along the way? And that to me is what the balance that we're trying to strike at the Pulitzer Center, and is our greatest passion, you know, is supporting these journalists who have that commitment to do something beyond just the breaking news.
And we're going to be talking in a moment about how students can find these stories, but I'd love to hear from both of you. Why do you think that these kinds of stories are important, especially for students? And maybe if there's an example that you want to share, that might be helpful as well.
I think that these stories are important for a number of reasons, but one of them is that they can really raise awareness, and they can help build empathy. These stories often take us to places, and not just physical places, that we've never been, and that we might never be if it weren't for this story that is bringing us to that place. I come from a background of investigative reporting, so one of the things that I appreciate about these kind of stories is that they can, because of their systemic nature and approach, they can expose wrongdoing, they can illuminate patterns of wrongdoing in society, and that means holding the powerful accountable. And that is why we do what we do in journalism. We want to illuminate dark places. We want to hold the powerful accountable, and hope that by the power of our journalism, not by the power of advocacy in our case, but the power of journalism, we can spark change. So while underreported stories can often feel uncomfortable because they show us and they confront us with disparities and inequality and violence in our society, they also can be sources of hope. And that's why I think they can work really well in the classroom. And they can even point at possible solutions for some of those deep problems in society.
Thank you. Natalie, did you want to add to that? I saw both of us going.
Marina said
nodding.
very perfectly. But I would just say, I mean, a theme I've kind of come back to over the years with the Pulitzer Center and the work that we do, and why I think it does also tie to education, as Marina said, is that we're focused on stories, underreported stories that have relevance now, right? But that are going to continue to have resonance for years to come, and that there are lessons to be learned in what we did wrong. There are lessons to be learned in what we do right. And that's the kind of journalism that continues to inform long after the publications come out. I mean, in terms of like why this is important, I mean, like, you know, we've been, our mantra for 14 years has been how global issues are local. You know, within the larger journalism landscape, there's been a lot of focus on local news organizations, and that's understood, and local issues. But to us, that distinction is a false dichotomy, right? Global issues are local issues as well. When we go to war in Afghanistan, that becomes a local issue. When we have a global health pandemic, it becomes a local issue. And so we ignore things that seem far away at a great cost to us locally. And if it has to come to saying, okay, it's not about just caring about the rest of the world, but you know, to us, this is why these issues matter, and why, even if it seems like a faraway story, there's a lot of lessons to be learned in your own community as well, right? And we redefined in the last year what we mean by global. We don't mean foreign. We mean, what are the issues that are sort of universal, that are cross-cutting? And those are underreported because they tend to not be just about the facts and the what, right? It is about the how and the why, as Marina said.
And as I would like to comment on what Nathalie said about that, for the stories that we choose to ignore are the stories that we pay the highest prices for as a society. And a colleague of mine here at Pulitzer Center was pointing out the other day the case of, if we go back to the flu of 1918, and there's a book out there that I haven't read yet, but he did. And what he learned in that book is that at the time of that pandemic, the media was consumed and struggling to cover, you know, the First World War. And there was a lot of self-censoring. And as a result, there was almost no news in newspapers at the time about this pandemic that ended up killing 600,000 Americans and like millions around the world. I'm back, now 100 years later, it still took the media a while to react to yet another pandemic. And now, we still, would like to see more of the underlying themes and the underreported angles to this pandemic than what we see when we turn on television, especially.
Thank you both. And I just want to repeat a few things that were said here before we talk about how students can find them. Hopefully they'll be motivated by some of these. So it's sounding like these are the kinds of stories that might affect them directly, either right now or in their futures, that these are stories that often highlight issues that might connect to students now or in their futures, and are highlighting people who might not be getting a lot of attention. As a former middle school teacher who also has worked quite a bit with high school students, this idea of, I have an important story, no one's paying attention to me, is something that my students could definitely relate to. So I think they could probably relate to a lot of the people covered in these stories. And they often highlight people who are advocating for change, and these stories often make change, which is something that might really resonate with students. Something that didn't come up yet, but you're about to see as we go into the presentations, is I've seen these stories also just really engage students. They're interesting. They speak about interesting people, inspiring people, and I see students perk up and lean forward as they're hearing about them. So that's something that also I think will draw students to these stories when they can find them. So let's talk about that question. How can students find these stories? And what we're going to do, hopefully you see my screen now, is we're going to move to exploring how there are 4 ways that students might even be able to practice at home to start identifying underreported stories in the news that they could read or watch, but they also might be able to use these 4 different ways to identify underreported stories in their own communities and maybe start to tell those stories themselves. So what we're going to explore now is, how can students critically analyze breaking news, talk to community members, closely observe their communities, and follow their passions to begin exploring underreported stories. And to start by telling us how we can look at breaking news in a critical way, I'll turn it over to Marina.
Wonderful. Thank you, Farid. I am going to share my screen, and so I can show you a few images of some of the stories we are supporting. I hope everyone can see my screen. And I wanted to tell you, so how do we teach students to differentiate between breaking news and underreported stories? I think it's important that we do that ourselves all the time. And even when we are thinking about our programs, for example, like right now, how does Pulitzer Center respond to the coronavirus situation in a thoughtful way? So I thought that by showing you how, what kind of stories we are supporting, it can give you pointers as to the kind of stories that the students might be looking for when they are looking for underreported stories. So we didn't want to support stories that were about the latest statistics or the latest political commentary. That is what is all the time in TV. That is what is available and what seems to consume 60–70% of the time. Instead, what we did is we challenged our journalists to find innovative approaches that cover underrepresented communities, as we said before. We challenged them to also find allies in other newsrooms. That's why we call it the Coronavirus News Collaboration Challenge. Not only in other newsrooms, but also in other areas of expertise, and to really dig deep in the underlying themes of the crisis. So here are some of the things and the stories that they came up with. An example from a Peruvian photographer, Mostoufi. He is looking at migration, what happens when we have stay-at-home orders for people who do not have a home, who are transient, who are mobile, and who, in this case, the story was called "The Bus That Never Arrives," because public transportation is also halted in Lima. And so what happens to this population? The story that is very close to home for many of you, teachers. And in this case, the portrait of a particular teacher in Philadelphia struggling to reconnect with her students. Because as we know, for many students, home is not a place that is or feels safe or feels adequate for learning. So that was a really good story that I recommend you look up in our website. The stories of smaller countries, what happens with a country like Paraguay, that we rarely see this country in the news. What happens when a country like this competes with bigger countries like the US for the very few equipment that is left, life-saving equipment to treat patients. So the answer is they pay exorbitant prices that with money they don't have, or they simply cannot take care of their patients. Another interesting angle, of course, is healthcare workers, but an underreported angle of healthcare workers is their mental health. What happens after 10, 12 weeks of being exposed to so much suffering and death? I really like this project that you're seeing here in the screen. It's called the 63106 project. And it's a project by a coalition of media organizations in St. Louis. And 63106 is a zip code that happens to be at the bottom of the health statistics in St. Louis. So they are looking specifically at the racial disparities and what it means for that particular community to face a pandemic like the one we're facing. So let me see, I think, no, this is for my next question. So I am done with that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen
and,
now.
Marina, may I ask, so what advice would you give to a student if they're looking at the news right now? What are some questions they might ask themselves to arrive at stories like the ones that you shared with us?
I think that's going to be answered a little bit when we go through the other themes, because the questions is like, they can ask themselves, what I see in the media, when I look around in my community, when I look around in my home, do I see the people? Do they look like the people around me? The problems that we are discussing at the dinner table, the issues that we are discussing at the dinner table, are they represented in the stories that I'm seeing all the time? The preoccupations that my grandparents are telling us that they have, those are some ways, you know, of observation around them. But we are going to be talking about other ways now, right?
It's a perfect segue, actually, because Natalie, I think you've prepared an example of how we could talk to the people around us to start to arrive at underreported stories.
Absolutely. So I'm also going to share my screen. And I mean, I think actually a lot of the examples that Marina just shared are extremely relevant about looking at your own communities. None of us can travel. You know, there's very limited in terms of what we would normally be supporting, thinking about how COVID specifically and that reporting, I think, are great examples of looking at your own communities as journalists. The example I thought of was, you know, this wonderful Filipino reporter, Jaiza Cruz Bacani. She's a young journalist who has just done really incredible work because she looked inward. And I guess I'll back up a little bit. We often get these proposals from journalists or phone calls from journalists who say, like, I want to, you know, get a grant from the Pulitzer Center. Like, how do I, you know, what should I pitch? And how do I go abroad? And I'm often saying, you don't have to go abroad, you know, to tell the kinds of stories we're interested in. You can, you know, build your resume up, your CV up, whatever, by just doing stories in your own communities. There are diaspora communities, there are global issues, there are education, you know, these sort of systemic root level crises that we're looking at are absolutely happening anywhere in the world, including our own neighborhoods. And so Jaiza is a photographer whose mother, you know, was a domestic worker in Hong Kong. And she grew up, you know, as an 8-year-old sort of traveling around and having to adapt to a very difficult world. And she took that situation and started to turn the lens inward. And as a result of that, she had access to people and stories that I couldn't have had, Marina couldn't have had, you know, no journalists we know could have actually interacted, you know, with the true personal stories that help translate and resonate in the way that, I mean, she's also an incredibly gifted photographer, obviously. We'll skip the ad. And, you know, capture a story that captures our attention. And when we go back to making broccoli beautiful, right? Like, how do you tell the stories of these completely underrepresented communities in a way that makes us want to know more and makes us care about them and makes us, you know, just dig deeper into these stories. And I just think Jaiza is a great example of that. I think for students, you know, reminding them that, like, the exoticness of foreign travel, of, you know, going beyond, we want to encourage global understanding in everything that we do at the Pulitzer Center. But it's also thinking about, you know, what is their grandmother's story? You know, what is the story of the taxi driver? What is the story of the local deli owner? You know, how is that connected to some of the issues that we do hear about in the news, but maybe there's an angle that's not being captured from what we're hearing. And so it comes back, I mean, many of you, if you're educators who have worked with us, it comes back, I think, to the everyday Africa, everyday DC, everyday Chicago work that we've done that relates back to, you know, what is, as Marina said, what's missing in the news and what's happening in my own community and why does it matter? And I think that those are stories that your students are in the best position to tell.
That is a great point, Natalie, about, you know, we don't need to go to exotic places. We don't need to find the news far from home. The personal stories, the ones that are close to us, can be the most powerful stories. And it's a good sequence also to the next point, right, Farid?
Absolutely.
Which is about observing the reality around us and also using that as, and I would talk about, like, helping students develop a curiosity for patterns that they see around them, and learning to ask the question that we said before, the question of why. I will share again my screen, and I will tell you about, let's see, Oh, one more. Are we sharing? Yes. My looks, let's see if I can share again. Yes, my computer doesn't want me to share the next slide, but I am going to fix that very quickly. I don't know, it's like, I think, here we go. Maybe now it will. I think now it might work. So let's give it this try. But I was going to bring my experience working on reporting on inequality issues. Most recently at my job at an organization called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And while working there, we started wondering, and can we see my screen now?
Yes.
Do we see a yacht?
Yes.
Great.
We
So
do.
we're all on the same page. And I was saying that when I was working at the ICIJ, which is a network of reporters in many countries around the world who work together on stories of global importance, much like the stories that Pulitzer Center supports. And we started asking ourselves by observing what our sources were saying and what we were reading in the news, why is it that the wealthiest members of society pay the least amount of taxes? Situations like the one we are seeing represented in this image, where the people that have privilege and have wealth are in some ways living in a parallel universe where they have laws and regulations that apply only to them, pay little taxes, and the burden is on regular citizens like the father with his son. That question of like why that happens is what was the root cause, was what led that observation. We couldn't answer the question at the time, but we started digging and documenting and talking to whistleblowers and talking to sources. And that led to an investigation and an expose that you might remember called the Panama Papers. And it was the biggest disclosure of financial information related to the so-called offshore world or tax haven world, which are these secret jurisdictions where those individuals, those powerful individuals and companies can hide their business and enjoy basically zero taxes. So this investigation led to a lot of change around the world. It doesn't mean that tax havens no longer exist. They exist, but it raised so much awareness. It led to policy changes. And it also went from being a topic that was kind of accepted in a strange way. Even editors were telling us at the beginning, but this is legal. And what we said, yes, this is legal. And that is precisely the problem. Many stories are legal. Slavery was legal at one point, and that doesn't make it right. These are profoundly immoral stories. Another example that can be even closer to the experience of your students has to do with water. So photographer and grantee, Pulitzer Center grantee Matt Black started observing around him after the Flint crisis, water crisis. And he realized, well, we're all talking about Flint and it's a really important story. And I'm so glad that the media is giving it all this attention. But in my travel around America, and Matt is a photographer, is an itinerant photographer, most of his projects are about getting in his car and traveling around the country, documenting realities. And in those journeys, he had realized that water contamination went far beyond Flint, and it was a reality all the way from like Fresno, California, to Kentucky and Mississippi and many other places. So his project for us, which is ongoing, is about documenting that difficult reality of many, many communities around the country, often communities of color that do not have access to clean tap water. And we can ask ourselves what that means in the context of a pandemic.
Thank you, Marina. And some really great questions were brought up here about how we can start to dig into our curiosity. I've been in classrooms with journalists before who've even asked students to just notice their classroom, or for students working from home, the room they're in, and notice what's an object you didn't really notice before. And what questions does that bring up for you about why that object is there and why it wasn't noticed before? So it could even be as simple as your own block, or you saw some great examples here of questions that might have come out of a conversation or breaking news, like the news about Flint, how that could lead to investigations for students.
Yeah, and also like Nathalie said, working with your family, I really like the how we can teach students to document and to find evidence by interviewing people in their own family, especially the grandparents. They have lived through so many things, fascinating places. Maybe they came from somewhere else. And so not only interviewing them about their journey and their story, but also asking them, do you have pictures? Do you have sometimes they have kept the ticket that they gave them when they boarded that ship that brought them to the US, or in my case, to Argentina. My grandparents came from Scotland by ship to Argentina, and the ship was called Amazon. So what other documents do they have? Birth certificates, letters that they were exchanging at a certain time that may illuminate a historical period.
Sounds like a scavenger hunt at home is in order for many of us to find some stories. And I know that what might happen is students might discover interest, or they might already have interest. So Nathalie, I know you have our final kind of tip for students, which is to follow our own interests.
Yeah, and I'm going to keep it super brief because there's so many really interesting questions here, but I will go ahead and share my screen and talk about just one project, one grantee in particular who it just showed this exceptional sort of passion for a story, and that's why we supported it. And I think in thinking about your students, again, it relates to what I was saying earlier about journalists sort of coming to us as a funder. You know, they want to know, like, well, what are you going to fund? Like, and they say, like, what topics, you know, do you want us to report on? And should I do this, or that? And our response is always, what are you most interested in? Don't think about what I'm interested in as a teacher. Don't think about what I'm interested in as a funder. Think about, like, what is the story that you most want to tell? And Rebecca Hamilton, you know, was passionate about Sudan. She had done previous work, journalism around it. She's a human rights lawyer, and she had particular insight, you know, and sort of a niche understanding of the situation in South Sudan around the time of the separation in 2011. And she submitted her proposal the night of her wedding. Like she got married and then like sent us this like 10-page proposal, you know, so that obviously translated as a deep, deep commitment of passion and understanding. And she went on, you know, so she came back. I mean, I picked this particular example because not only did she show a commitment at that time, but 10 years later, she came back to it, or nearly 10 years later, she came back to it and then, you know, focused on it again. And so she just recently did reporting from the region, looking at where we are now, trying to understand the role of the US and sort of conflicting messages that our policy has had in Sudan and South Sudan. So I think there's so many examples. I mean, if we to talk about passion projects and with Pulitzer Center grantees, it would be hard to say that any of them aren't, because we specifically, we have the ability to choose projects that are. And so these are journalists that just really care about these issues. They're not doing it because they have to, they're doing it because they want to. So from a teacher's perspective, I think anything you can do to help students identify those issues that they really care about, those are going to be the best stories. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. And at this point, we definitely want to get into the questions here that will also help us identify some of the challenges that might come up as students start to investigate underreported stories. Let's start with a question about say students are starting either from looking at breaking news or starting to interview people in their communities, and they land on really difficult topics. What is your advice for helping students navigate stories that might be really sad? Maybe if they encounter a story that is introducing them to something that is overwhelming for them, what advice would you offer for teachers?
You want to take that one, Natalie?
I don't know. I mean, I almost feel like Fareed's in a better position,
Yeah.
having worked more directly with educators. But I mean, I think that there's, I think listening to what the student is experiencing, and I think there's always a way to look at a solutions response lens, which can also really help, instead of just focusing. I mean, there's a sort of school of journalism right now kind of called the solutions journalism. And in our view, all good journalism, incorporates solutions journalism in a sense, and that we should always, if we're talking about problems, we should also be looking at solutions. And if we're looking at what's causing something, then that should be leading us to a better understanding of how do we address it. So I think giving your students a little hope there, and redirecting them from just how many dead to, okay, what can be done about this? Even if we don't have all the answers all the time.
And that question came from Laureen, who also asked about access to reporting in different languages on our website. Please reach out to education@pulitzercenter.org, and we are happy to help navigate you to reporting that might fit your class. We've done reporting in a lot of different, or supported reporting in a lot of different languages. I want to combine a question here from Lenore and from Martha that has to do with fake news. And as we're introducing students to the idea of underreported stories, how do we navigate questions about fake news, especially when students start to shut down when they hear the term news?
I think it's important because we live at a time of unprecedented distrust in the media and polarization as well. So one technique I would apply, if we know that there are certain media brands that are going to trigger that kind of response, like shut down, I would try to look for underreported stories or important stories and put those in front of them that are perhaps done by media organizations that maybe they have never heard of, but that are incredible, like ProPublica, like the Marshall Project on criminal justice issues, like Chuck Beat on education issues, like Mission Local, a community outlet doing great work on immigration in California. So perhaps avoid a little bit the media that unfortunately has fallen into the traps of this polarization, and direct them to great reporting. Natalie.
Yes, and talk to journalists. I mean, I think one of the most effective ways is bring a journalist. Like, we can help you arrange that. I think having the ability to have a conversation with what a journalist is doing and thinking, is certainly a way to understand the methodologies behind journalism and challenge this distrust that's going around.
And finally, also teach them to recognize what good quality journalism is by dissecting a good story. So what are the parts of that, the fundamental and the essential parts of a good story? Multiple sources, enough and sufficient and a lot of detail. Nuance, how do we find nuance in a story? Context, historical context. So I think that if they can do that kind of text analysis and learn to identify those good qualities or good quality journalism, maybe they'll think twice next time when they see a story that seems to fit that it seems like a really substantive story, and they can go past the outlet or what other people are saying around them.
And Julie makes a great, added an important comment on this point, just talking about how long it can take for students to buy into things. And so I would add too, to the tips that we were just hearing, one thing I've heard is for students who feel overwhelmed by these issues is an important, especially our very mission-oriented change maker students. Sometimes I've heard journalists remind them that they are taking action by hearing the story of someone whose story has not been heard by a lot of people. And so that is an action, listening to someone's story. And in terms of buy-in, I've also seen a lot of success with very human-centered stories. So starting with stories where maybe about people their age, maybe in a place that they haven't thought about at all. And often those personal stories build a relationship where then students become invested in an issue. What I'd like to close out with here, before we get our final tips from our panelists, is a great question about, from Martha here, how do we support students' sometimes extremely niche interests in light of their novice research skills and limited information or lack of information about their topics? So if I have a student who says to me, I'm not interested in anything, or nothing's going on that's interesting around me, or they're only passionate about a thing that they don't think connects to news, what are some questions they could ask themselves, or some actions they could take to dig deeper and find a reported story in their communities or following their own interests? Or stories about pop culture, Julie adds, that might be their interest.
I think it is important, I would go back to the passions. I think you have to start somewhere. And if they at least have a passion, whether it's like for the science fair, my son could not think of anything but baseball because that's all that is in his mind these days. He ended up doing a really good science project on, on baseball and the velocity and other stuff. So I would actually try to work with what they care about right now and see how that can trigger an interest, perhaps trying to see how that can connect to a bigger issue or to a more important or universal theme.
I totally agree with that.
And I really appreciate in some of the conversations we've had before this session, or that I've heard journalists having with students, is asking, who are all of the people impacted or connected to this topic or this issue? And whose voices am I hearing a lot of, and whose voices am I not hearing at all? Could be a really interesting way to begin, whether if it's a pop culture story, maybe what are those questions there that might launch into a deeper underreported story connected to that pop culture event or a sport like baseball.
We have a really good question there about whether, should we let students know they might not be able to solve a problem, but being aware is still possible. Of course, journalism, ultimately, we would love to think that journalism can trigger change, societal change, profound change, and that sometimes happens. But just raising that kind of awareness and being able to build, every little story, every story builds on the knowledge and introduces important new knowledge and awareness to society. And even that is a big win.
And I would just add to that, I mean, it's a great question, and it's something, having gone through years of presenting very, depressing sometimes stories to students, the first question is always like, what can I do? What can I do? And our answer, is usually, I think mostly, learn more. Don't try to act before you know all of the facts, as much of and do that research. And that's the role of journalism. It ties back, the role of journalism and their role in what they ask for in terms of information that's getting out there, and what they click on, right, affects what information they're getting. And so it's all part of this cycle. And I think that they have a responsibility, and I think instilling that in them is also really, really important as we think about the future of journalism.
And I would love to say that there's a role in journalism that unfortunately we want to see more of, and it's the role of the fact checker. I was saying unfortunately because a lot of media organizations have had to let their fact checkers go. Students can become fact checkers, and they probably would love that because it gives them power. and it's the power to scrutinize facts and to do their own research and to see if they can find substance to those facts, if they can find evidence. So let's teach an army of fact checkers that become really involved and in love with finding evidence for quality stories.
I love that idea. So as we start to collaborate to get our students excited about underreported stories, the team here at the Pulitzer Center is curious of these 4 approaches, and fact checker should be on here too, of these 4 approaches to beginning to investigate underreported stories. Which do you think would work best for or most interest the students you are working with now? So if we could launch our final poll here, and you're welcome to answer with more than one of these. Do you think while students are learning remotely or as they start to come back to school, would they most easily find underreported stories by looking at the breaking news and asking some of the questions that were shared with us, talking to the people in their lives or closely observing their immediate environments, or by really focusing in and getting curious about their interests? So a few more moments to respond here, and let's go ahead and close that poll and see how we responded. I love the the kind of even split here, but I think we see that following their interests not only is the advice from our panelists today, but also it sounds like what will excite the students. So there's some synergy. Well, one thing that we hope to do to help support you all in getting students excited about this work is we are actually going to be releasing some curricula in the next few weeks that we hope will support students in getting started with looking at underreported stories on their own. So if you're not subscribed to our newsletter, please subscribe. There'll be an opportunity to do that with the survey at the end of our session, and you'll be receiving information about that curricula. And also, please join us to start to connect with some of the teachers and the journalists that Pulitzer Center has collaborated with to explore these stories and to share them. Our next webinar for educators is this upcoming Wednesday at 2 o'clock, exploring the Home Story Chicago project, which is a descriptive writing, interview, and visual storytelling project inspired by the Out of Eden Walk from National Geographic Fellow and Pulitzer Center grantee Paul Salopek. We'll also have a journalist, Melissa Noel, leading a live webinar for students the following Wednesday, May 20th, to describe her reporting on how young people in the Caribbean have been impacted by the experience of having their parents move abroad to other countries for work while they remain in their home countries. And we will also have a webinar for students led by filmmaker Robert Taconnell about his film featuring intersex activist describing her experience, their experience coming from Zimbabwe to New York City. And we will actually have the subject of that documentary, an inspiring figure, Tatenda, will be joining us to speak about being in the film and about their experience. So we hope you'll join for that. And if you're inspired by any of the reporting you saw today and you think your students would get excited about it, please encourage them to use that reporting or any Pulitzer Center reporting they're interested in to write original poetry using lines from that story, submit to our poetry contest, and they could not only win cash prizes, publication on the Pulitzer Center site, but also get their voices out there. The deadline for that contest is next Friday. That brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. Can we have some applause in the chat here for our panelists and for all of you? Thank you so much, Marina and Natalie, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And if you could stick with us for 2 more minutes, as soon as I close this meeting, there'll be a very short survey for us to continue improving these experiences and learning how we can continue to support you. Thank you all and take care.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
so much.